You know, this is, excuse me, a damn fine cup of coffee.
This morning, we are continuing our journey through dimensions by the great Dr. Jacques Vallée, a casebook for alien contact. We are on chapter 8, the Triple Coverup. We're going to get down and dirty with the intimate history of Project Bluebook and Mr. Condon, the scientist who shut it down, and then follow it up with the modern cover-up, and then the cover-up of our minds and how just, talking about this kind of stuff makes you a bit of a freak. Let's get into it. Chapter 8, the Triple Coverup. This chapter starts with a couple quotes. This first one is from a letter from the chief of the Chilean naval mission to an American writer. We are pleased to acknowledge the receipt of your letter regarding the photographs showing UFOs in formational flight, which you mentioned were taken by Captain Orrego of the Chilean Navy near Antarctica in 1948. Regarding this matter, we wish to inform you that we recently received a communication from Captain Orrego stating that he had not seen any UFOs over Antarctica in 1948. Therefore, the photographs requested by you do not exist. A letter from the chief of the Chilean naval mission to an American writer. It is forbidden for TV, radio, newspapers, and other news media to divulge UFO reports without the prior censorship of the Brazilian Air Force. Institutional Act Number 5, State Security, Brazilian Government Regulation. So just some samples here of government regulations against information about UFOs. Or UAPs, the Invisible College. After some 30 years of research into this phenomena, I have reached new conclusions. Tentative as they are, they shed light onto the experience of abductees and the reluctance of professional scientists to analyze the facts. I believe that a UFO is both a physical entity with mass, inertia, volume, and physical parameters that we can measure, and a window into another reality. Is this why witnesses can give us at the same time a consistent factual narrative and a description of contact with forms of life that fit no acceptable framework? These forms of life, such as the small gray men seen by Kathy, may be real, yet a product of our dreams. Like our dreams, we can look into their hidden meaning or we can ignore them. But like our dreams, they may also shape our lives in many ways. The phenomenon has made a significant impact in my own experience. On 2 occasions, I have tracked some unknown objects using small telescopes. A few of my astronomer colleagues made similar observations, and after making inquiries, we became aware of sightings kept confidential by professional astronomers all over the world. The objects we were tracking were not spectacular, but the reaction they elicited among French scientists fascinated me. Instead of asking if these seemingly maneuverable and impossible objects could be a manifestation of some advanced technology, and in some cases they may well have been terrestrial, they thought only of suppressing the records. They did this by denying every observation, by blaming it on airplanes or planes when the documentation was unassailable, and by destroying the data when it was demonstrated that no airplane could have behaved as the objects did. The insight I derived from this early experience with dogmatic scientific skepticism brought me into contact with professionals who, like myself, wanted to understand the nature of the phenomena, and especially to determine whether or not it had intelligent origin. The group has grown larger over the years. Whimsically, it calls itself the Invisible College. Dr. J. Allen Hynek, the American astronomer, who served for over 20 years as the Air Force's scientific consultant on UFOs, explained that name in an article called The UFO Mystery, published in the FBI Bulletin, February 1975. Way back in the dark ages of science, when scientists themselves were suspected of being in the league with the devil, they had to work privately. They often met clandestinely to exchange views and the results of their various experiments. For this reason, they called themselves the Invisible College, and it remained invisible until the scientists of that day gained respectability when the Royal Society was chartered by Charles II in the early 1660s. My interest in UFOs has gone through several phases. but my curiosity has never been satisfied about the behavior of scientists who destroy, distort, or simply ignore the very facts that they should investigate. Scientists are not the only ones to blame for the unfortunate stigma still attached to this subject, but such a gap has appeared between the academic position of the beliefs of millions of people and the re-examination of the entire problem is now imperative. We have on one hand the facts, thousands of unexplained observations by reliable witnesses. They stand as a monument to the limitations of our understanding. My book, Passport to Magonia, published in 1970, contained a catalog of 923 unexplained close encounters. And the size of this evidence is increasing daily. I'll tell you what, this Beeps and Bobbles guy, he is here every day, every time, every Saturday he's here. Maybe one day I'll buy a Beep and Bob, I don't know. And the size of this evidence is increasing daily. On the other hand, we have a paucity of theories to account for the richness of data. Either these encounters must be invention, delusion, hoax, and mirages, the experts tell us, or else we are being visited by an extraterrestrial race. I cannot subscribe to either explanation. I have argued for many years that the phenomenon could not be explained by hoax and illusion alone, that it contains an opportunity to obtain genuine new knowledge. In this section, I hope to go a step further and show why these unexplained observations need not represent a visitation from space visitors, but something even more interesting, a window toward undiscovered dimensions of our own environment. Much of my motivation for examining critically the extraterrestrial theory has come from a study of the information of witness accounts, processed on a computer using modern techniques of analysis. And today that would be like AI or something. But this was back in the day, he had to crunch the numbers himself on a computer. Many of these accounts come from witnesses who describe the occupants of the craft. This material is rich enough for us to form a good idea of these beings' physiology and behavior. If it, in fact, corresponded to the conditions of biological evolution we can assume on other planets, what we obtain instead is a picture of a different reality that seems to cut through our own at right angles. It is the reality of Magonia. But there is more. In 1971, after an unusual UFO sighting, several puzzling objects fell from the sky. These mysterious fragments were picked up by a Texan who made the mistake of showing them to his friends. The next day, 2 men from the Air Force Intelligence came to his door, exhibited their identification papers, and politely requested the evidence. The witness threw them out rudely with a statement that I find admirable. God has made everything in this world, and he has made flying saucers too, whatever they are. These fragments have fallen into my backyard, and therefore God clearly intended for me to have them. If he had wanted the Air Force to have them, he would have dumped them on the Pentagon. I mean, you're not wrong. In a survey of technically trained witnesses who had seen an unidentified flying object, it was found that the proportion of those who had bothered to call the Air Force while Project Bluebook was operating was only 1 in 12. Woohoo! Like we're saying, thousands and thousands of encounters out there, the numbers. This attitude toward the authorities is an important component of the UFO phenomenon. The idea of a cosmic mystery lingers in the more shadowy areas of our imagination. Could it be that the reaction of our societies to suppress the reports, to cover them up individually and collectively, is as much a part of the UFO phenomena as the objects themselves? I mean, yeah, maybe. I don't know. Is it, Jacques? It makes me think like yin and yang, like balance. So of course then, if this phenomenon's out there, this great, wonderful, mysterious phenomenon, there's going to be a great and powerful, not so helpful force, dark force, evil force, whatever you want to consider it, that's going to be against it, you know? The first cover-up, official denial. First level of cover-up is in the reporting of UFOs. It is the result of the closed mind and negative attitude of government, scientific, and military authorities. More specifically, I call the quote-unquote first cover-up the efforts made by those in a position of authority to discourage the reporting of a UFO incident. This can range from the hostile laughter of a local deputy sheriff to the intimidation of pilots by their commanding officers, or confiscation of evidence from the witnesses. In some cases, the public is led to believe that reporting UFOs is unnecessary because the government knows all about them. Late in 1964, for instance, several friends in Paris sent me interesting data. It seems that somebody there was trying to spread UFO stories through the French news media. The French word for such spreading of rumors is intoxication. A former member of the intelligence service who was regarded as a reliable source made statements to the effect that the British military was carefully monitoring the UFO situation and was pooling its information with the Russians. He went on to say that both countries had now come to the conclusion that the objects were real. Another story circulated among Paris journalists came from an American who claimed that the FBI had compiled exhaustive studies of the U.S. cases, a rumor that appears to be at least partially true, because some landing cases have had elements that had brought the event within the jurisdiction of the Bureau. Real life X-Files. In both these stories, which originated from quasi-official sources, there was the same reassuring theme. People should not worry about UFOs and should leave the investigation in the hands of competent authorities who knew everything there was to know. We are all well protected. There is nothing to see here, folks. Do not worry about them lights in the sky. Do not worry about them drones you see. In the meantime, there was mounting uneasiness among the scientists who had been involved in the UFO debate. Observations were not only coming from witnesses who have outdoor activities like farmers and truck drivers, but from technically trained observers like engineers, doctors, and professors. The U.S. government must not have known everything there was to know because in August 1965, Colonel Spaulding made inquiries among the top scientists associated with his office at the Air Force. He asked them specifically what they thought of submitting the UFO files to the Academy of Sciences, or to some such highly respected body, in a renewed effort to reassure the public and find out the truth. As a result, early in November 1965, the Scientific Advisory Board of the Air Force met in Dallas and discussed the UFO question. The idea of so-called independent study was first considered at that meeting. Physicist Dr. Brian O'Brien, sick name, headed a special study group that came back with the recommendation that the Air Force spend $250,000 a year to obtain quote-unquote high-grade data. The very fact that a new study was recommended seems to show that any suppression of information or any leaking of wild rumors was not the result of a secret military police on the UFO subject, but more likely a product of the confusion that is rampant at all levels of federal bureaucracy. The military was reacting to the sightings in direct proportion to their impact on the press, which they were trying to minimize, and these reactions were clumsy. The confusion that resulted was unbelievable. The best example of this was the swamp gas crisis. So let's learn the origins. Swamp gas, the swamp gas scandal. What he's talking about here, it's how they build the case, how they, gaslight us, gaslight us into believing what we saw we didn't see. What we saw was some, ball lightning or just swamp gas, something to be explained away. So they plant seeds like this when there's really not a lot of truth there. It's just their explanation to calm the waters. The swamp gas episode played a decisive role in influencing public opinion at a key moment in the history of the UFO problem. So it provides a model for local and national passion. The swamp gas crisis began for me on Monday morning, March 21st, 1966. I was listening to a Chicago radio program when the news of the Michigan sighting was broadcast. 4 objects were said to have flown over a farm near Ann Arbor, and one of them had landed in a swampy area. It sounded fairly typical. In 1964, I had established that more landings tended to occur in isolated places. a fact that was first apparent in the computer analysis of the French cases. Eventually, using Air Force data, I convinced Dr. Hynek that the same pattern existed in the United States. Swamps like the Everglades regions of Florida and rugged regions like Central France or the American Northwest were among the places UFOs seemed to prefer. In 1965, as I have pointed out, there have been a series of reports by Australian farmers describing craft that left circular traces in swamp vegetation there. And he has a whole chapter about those. They call them angel circles or angel nests. That Monday morning, I called Dr. Hynek to alert him to the sightings in Michigan. And he, in turn, called Project Bluebook in Dayton, Ohio, to propose that it investigate it at once. He suggested that we go there before reporters and curiosity seekers destroyed the evidence. The officer in Dayton was not interested, as Dr. Hynek later told me. The case hasn't been reported officially to the Air Force, said the officer. That's not very scientific, Dr. Hynek remarked. I don't give a damn, was the literal answer. Half an hour later, Project Bluebook called back. How soon can you be in Ann Arbor? I thought you weren't interested. Well, someone has reported the case officially to us just a minute ago. What? Who was that? The Pentagon. They are deluged with calls. Every reporter in the country wants to know what's going on. The next morning, Dr. Hynek was in Michigan. What happened in Ann Arbor is a classic example of misunderstanding with the press. Hynek was under tremendous pressure to release a statement prematurely, at the urging of public relations people from the Air Force. In his statement, he called for thorough investigation of the phenomena, but also mentioned that some people in Michigan might have seen swamp gas. Ooh! The press took this for the final verdict and exploded with anger. How dare this academic man from Chicago challenge the word of an honest farmer and seriously suggest that he had not seen what was evidently a real flying saucer. Those irate comments came from the same newspapers who for years had ridiculed witnesses just like this poor farmer and had given no support whatsoever to Dr. Hynek when he begged them to report UFO cases more accurately. Suddenly, it became fashionable to believe in flying saucers. In March 1966, much like it is today again, the cycle continues. Reporters were beating the bushes of Michigan looking for Martians and UFO experts. The switch took the Air Force by surprise and destroyed the image of Project Bluebook in a few short days. Public reaction carried the case to Washington, with help from then local politician Gerald Ford, who demanded that full attention be given to what had become known as the swamp gas scandal. You know, I like old Jerry Ford ever since that Simpsons episode back in the day. A meeting of the Space Committee of the Senate pondered the question first and decided quickly that NASA should not get involved. The space agency had its public image to preserve and declined to have anything to do with the subject. So they handed this hot potato to the Armed Forces Committee of the House. Early in April 1966, the Secretary of the Air Force was reported to be in favor of a scientific analysis of the 648 cases classified as unidentified, at that time in Bluebook files. Late that month, the governor of Florida and several reporters saw an unknown flying object from the governor's private plane. These reports created a stir, but the outrage over the Michigan incident had already subsided. It was almost 2 months old and no longer newsworthy. An official cover-up was falling back into place. A television documentary carried the debunking of the subject to new heights. It showed Harvard astronomer Donald Menzel pouring some benzene over a tank full of acetone to demonstrate optical properties that were common knowledge since the 18th century. He was trying to convince an audience that UFOs were nothing but mirages. "Let me know the next time it rains benzene, will you?" I asked my wife. "We'll go out and watch the flying saucers." Menzel's number was followed by a classic interview with a quote-unquote contactee, who was relied upon to provide comic relief by describing his meetings with the Space Brothers. His edited statements seemed to be carefully chosen to make him look as crazy as possible. In contrast with this man, the next interview was an impressive discussion with another astronomer who stated, with authority, that extraterrestrial visitations were extremely improbable. The documentary also contained an interview with a military officer who stated that no UFOs were ever detected on radar screens. and an interview with an astronomer who declared that no UFOs were ever seen or photographed by satellite tracking stations. Both statements were outright lies. It is true that radar never, quote unquote, sees UFOs, but that is only because the military operators call them something else. In their jargon, they speak of UCTs. Well, it's not even UAPs. What? Unidentified correlated targets. At the time of the documentary, the Western Defense System was recording about 700 of these baffling UCTs per month. Oh, isn't that diabolical? They're like, yeah, no, we don't know about any UFOs or UAPs. Then you do a little digging, you're like, oh, you just called them UCTs. Ooh. There had never been a suggestion by a highly respected astronomer that the military modified their computer program to gather information about these UCTs, rather than ignoring them because they didn't fit the trajectory of incoming missiles. The suggestion was not implemented. Well. UCTs, huh? Interesting. The next couple sections, which we're not going to get into in detail, go over how Dr. Hynek became a bit of a lone wolf. There were some other scientists who were open to talk about this stuff in public and how the UFO phenomenon was real, but largely he was left alone and to look like a loon. Next up, we have Dr. Condon. Now, Dr. Condon was the man, a close to retirement physicist who was hired by the Air Force to deconstruct UFO sightings in 1966 when there was all this great interest. Condon and his boys are hired to debunk the whole thing, and that leads us to our next section, destroying the data. November 1966. When the Condon Committee started gathering testimony from people who had done research into UFO cases, Dr. Hynek and I were the first scientists to be asked to come to Boulder to brief the group. We soon noticed that one of the administrators, Bob Lowe, was clearly the key decision maker on the team, although he had no science degree and seemed to have little interest in the matter. Yet, there was a certain euphoric feeling in the room, a sense of embarking on a unique adventure. There was little passion in the press now. The Michigan swamp gas crisis had been largely forgotten. The problem was in the hands of the scientists, and it had become as dull as any venture that is in the process of being rationalized away by the academic mill. If the journey to the moon can be turned into an exasperating bore that modern technology has generated, there is no reason to expect that the same lack of interest will not settle over the UFO mystery once it falls into the hands of big science. Ooh, look out for big science, baby. The first astronauts to die in orbit will probably die in Nui when they run out of buttons to push, digits to read out, and jokes with Houston about the football scores. Is that boredom? What's that word mean? As early as February 1967, members of the Condon Committee were privately approaching their scientific colleagues on other campuses, asking them how they would react if the committee's final report to the Air Force were to recommend closing down Project Bluebook. Not surprisingly, a few months later, the work of the committee had come to a standstill. Field investigations were non-existent. Questionnaires were sent out to witnesses, but only one assistant was available to encode the results for the computer file, where the bulk of the information was provided by those 1,000 punch cards I had turned over to the committee. A minority faction of the group caused a crisis when it rebelled. After a series of incidents that Dr. Dave Saunders documented in his book, UFOs? Yes! That book sounds amazing. The team split into two factions. An early restricted memorandum discovered and published by the minority group provided evidence that the Condon Committee had never intended to look seriously into the UFO problem. No matter what the organization is, even if it's some big bad org you hate, there is some good people in there trying to do right. Just like on the Condon Committee, it wasn't all people trying to suppress. There was a small rebel group, which tends to happen just like in stories, right? That fought against the big bad. Publication of this document so outraged Condon that he fired the minority group and he ran the project without any further consideration of the possible reality of the phenomenon. Ain't that how it go? The files of the committee were eventually destroyed. One would think that they belonged to the scientific fraternity or to the public domain, since American taxpayers paid for the research. Not so. When the project wrote its report, the files were locked up by the University of Colorado in Boulder. They were later transferred to a private home and were burned shortly thereafter. The second cover-up, convenient explanations. The little town of Carteret lies on the western coast of Normandy, France, about 20 miles from Cherbourg. It is situated directly to the north of the wonderful Mount St. Michael, a monastery that, as legend goes, was built by the devil. On December 2nd, 1973, a very strange thing happened on the beach of Carteret. Two fishermen, Mr. G. Jean, 44, and his son Noel, 18, got up at 5 a.m. to retrieve their nets at low tide. When they arrived at the beach, half an hour later, they saw a very bright object directly over the area where their nets had been spread. They walked around toward it, and they estimated that they were about 150 yards away, and it appeared as an intense yellow quote-unquote window, 8 feet long and 5 feet high, emanating a cone-like beam directed toward the ground. The two fishermen were afraid and decided not to go closer. They tried to work without thinking about the object, but then it changed suddenly. The yellow light was turned off. Over the area where it had been hovering, there was now a blue-green football that flew away at 6:05 a.m. The Jeans reported the sighting to the French police. It's just like, oh, just keep working, guys. Ignore the UFO. My wife and I investigated this sighting during a research trip through the west of France in December 1973. Many strange data came to the surface. First, we found that this was not the first sighting. 2 months earlier, the young man had seen a yellow sphere in staggered formation over the same beach while driving with his brother-in-law. That sighting took place about 7 p.m. The spheres appeared to be about 12 to 15 feet above the ground. Since the second sighting, the elder man has decided not to go out of his house anymore. He no longer goes fishing. He locks himself in his room. When the investigators come to ask him questions, does he know something he does not want to discuss? He's just scared, man. We saw no traces on the beach. The gendarmes confirmed to us that the grass in the dunes had not been affected. The barbed wire nearby was checked for magnetic effects. The test was negative. We heard that a local ham radio amateur had noticed at the time of the near landing that his receiver was blocked out for several minutes. There is a large radar installation near Cherbourg at a place called Maupertuis, located 38 kilometers away from Carteret. The range of the antenna is 200 kilometers. At 6:10 a.m. on this particular morning, it picked up an echo in the southwest, moving to the north of Cherbourg. An object flying from the direction of Carteret toward Great Britain would have followed this course. The same morning, something peculiar happened on the coast. The French trawler Archipel, which was close to the rocky shore of Urville, directly west of Cherbourg, on the trajectory of the object must have followed if the radar echo corresponds to the UFO, went off course. In view of the frequently observed magnetic perturbations in the vicinity of a UFO, it can be hypothesized that its magnetic navigation system gave erroneous indications. The boat got too close to the coast, hit the rocks, and sank, fortunately without the loss of life. The observation of the yellow quote-unquote window on the beach had lasted no less than 5 minutes. Why had the two fishermen not walked closer to the object to ascertain its nature? There seems to be two reasons. First, the quote-unquote window became brighter as they walked within 150 yards, and this discouraged them from approaching any closer. And second, they felt paralyzed with fear. Whether this paralysis was an actual physiological inhibition or the result of psychological fear, or both, has not been ascertained. The observation had taken place early Sunday morning. The following Friday, local people discovered some interesting items on a nearby beach. These consisted of a complete set of professional underwater exploration equipment, a radioactivity tester, sonic signalers, along with trousers and jackets with English language labels. Suddenly, the local police, with the assistance of the DST, the French counterintelligence, and the SDECE, the main intelligence arm of the French government, quote-unquote, discovered that the whole sighting was a case of underwater radiation detection. Such was the substance of the carefully designed rumor that began circulating. So the whole UFO light show was just because they were detecting things underwater. That's what Jacques talks about with like a convenient, nonsensical explanation of the event. It reminds me of the attacks that were happening in South America with the people being, I think in Peru, who were attacked by what the media dubbed, what the explanation is now, I guess, miners with rocket packs, guys doing some mining work and then deciding to rocket into the village and try and kidnap people, which seems like that's crazier to me than I don't know, but yeah, it just seems like the same. Then we all just like, oh, that's the explanation. It's like miners with rocket packs. Just like here, oh, it's just divers. There's some divers with radiation equipment. How could the discovery of some diving equipment on a nearby beach explain the 2 observations of the unidentified objects? What about the radar echo? The explanation is completely invalid, but it is typical of stories engineered to discredit witnesses and reassure local populations. These objectives are generally reached. The witnesses are intimidated, and the local police, the only source of accurate data, are generally anxious to see things return to normal. Besides, they have jobs to protect. So the French have always been way more open-minded about UFOs, and they're great wrestling fans, pro wrestling fans. And in March of 1974, their Minister of Defense, Robert Galli, agreed to participate in a series of radio interviews that included reports from witnesses and statements by 3 French scientists who have studied the UFO phenomenon for many years. This was his quote: "I am deeply convinced that we must regard these phenomena with an attitude of completely open mind. A number of breakthroughs have been made in the history of mankind because someone has attempted to explain the unexplainable. Now, among these aerial phenomena that have been gathered under the label of UFOs, it is undeniable that there are facts that are unexplained or badly explained. In 1954, the Defense Ministry created a special section for the gathering and study of witness accounts regarding these unidentified flying objects. I have before me a number of these accounts that have developed over the years until 1970. There are approximately 50 of them. Among the earliest ones is a statement of personal observation by Lieutenant d'Emery Jean from Air Force Base 107, dated November 20th, 1953. There are also reports from the Grande Marie and some observations from pilots and air center commanders. There are many elements whose convergence of this is of concern during the year 1954. Therefore, the attitude one must have is that of completely open mind, an attitude in which one does not deny the observations as fake or hallucination. Our ancestors in prior centuries must have denied the reality of a number of things that seem today to us absolutely elementary, like piezoelectricity, static electricity, and not to mention biological phenomena. In fact, the entire development of science consists in the fact that at a given time, we realize that we have mistaken ideas about the reality of a certain phenomenon. It is difficult to add anything to this statement. It is not clear that the simple fact of keeping an open mind about UFOs will in itself make a breakthrough possible, but science should certainly welcome the lifting of the government's attitude that has prevented it from examining the facts. And that was all the way back in 47. It's like when Eisenhower gives his military-industrial complex speech. Then we have the third cover-up. The UFO denies itself. We have so far discussed 2 forms of cover-up. 1, pressure placed on witnesses to discourage them from telling their story. And 2, fabrication of quote-unquote explanations. When a witness does speak, I believe that these factors must add a third one, the built-in silencing mechanism of the phenomena itself. On December 3rd, 1967, a patrolman named Herb Schimmer of Ashland, Nebraska, had an experience that deserves to be placed in the context of the stories of abduction of Betty and Barney Hill and of the Pasagola fishermen. At 2:30 a.m., Schimmer saw on the road an object with a row of flickering lights. Believing it to be a truck, he turned on his high beams. The object took off. The 22-year-old patrolman drove back to the station and wrote his entry. Saw a flying saucer at the junction of highways 6 and 63, believe it or not. Schimmer went home with a strong headache and a buzzing noise that prevented him from sleeping. He also had a red welt below his left ear. The case came to the attention of the Condon Committee, and Schimmer was placed under hypnosis. It then became clear that there was a 20-minute period during which he remembered nothing. Later, at the suggestion of another researcher, he was again placed under hypnosis, revealing an extraordinary sequence of events. As he saw the object take off, the patrolman decided to follow it and drove up a dirt road toward the intense light. He tried to call the police in Wahoo, Nebraska, but the radio was not working, and the car engine died. The object, metallic and football-shaped, was surrounded by a silvery glow. It was making a whooshing sound, and the lights were flickering rapidly. Legs appeared under the craft, and it landed. Shimmer wanted to drive home, but he was prevented by something in his mind. The occupants of the craft came toward the car. He was unable to draw his revolver. In the standard pattern, they shot some greenish gas toward the car, pulled a small object from his holster, flashed a bright light at him, and he passed out. We've read hundreds of cases so far where the same thing happens. Exact same type of thing. Something lands, your brain just doesn't let you leave. Next thing you know, they're shooting gas at you, and you're passed out. The next thing Shimmer remembered under hypnosis was rolling down the car window and talking to the occupant of the craft, who pressed something against the side of his neck and asked him, "Are you the watchman over this place?" Then pointed to the power plant and said, "Is this the only source of power you have?" Shimmer was taken aboard the craft. He saw control panels and computer-like machines. The occupants were wearing coveralls with an emblem of a winged serpent. One of them pushed a button and tape started running. "Through my mind, somehow. He is telling me things. My mind hurts." That's a quote from Shimmer. The occupants gave Shimmer a lot of interesting but clearly misleading information. They wanted him to believe that they came from a nearby galaxy, that they had bases in the United States. Their craft was operated by reverse electromagnetism. Their ships had been knocked out of the air by radar, by ionization. They drew power from large water reservoirs. I mean, a lot of UFOs have been seen sucking up water. Shimmer got the idea that they have no pattern for contacting people. It is by pure chance. So the government cannot determine any patterns about them, and there will be a lot more contacts. To a certain extent, they want to puzzle people, he reported. They know they are being seen too frequently, and they are trying to confuse the public's mind. Finally, the occupant told Shimmer that he was not to remember the inside of the ship. He concluded, "You will not speak wisely about this night. We will return to see you 2 more times." And at that point, in a hauntingly beautiful moment, one of the men took Shimmer to a large window of the ship, pointed to the deserted landscape around them, and said gravely, "Watchman, someday you will see the universe." If the occupants are so advanced and do not want Shimmer to speak wisely of the night, why could he remember so much of it under hypnosis? Have they not anticipated this method of disclosure? Or could it be that some parts of the human mind are inaccessible to them? Could it be that their power is more limited than their actions imply? Could it be that someone or something is playing a fantastic trick on us? Part of the third cover-up as well in this last section goes into the propagation of UFO cults. These people who might or might not have an actual experience, but then turn that into something completely absurd that that a group of people end up following, sometimes to their very detriment of their own lives. It gets into how that happens through the story of Mrs. Keach. Go ahead, look that up if you're into it. No, cults are such, we all know, there's so many freaking cult documentaries. You already know, all right? Bad news, no matter what the origins of, don't join some group that claims to know it all. But that's part of the third cover-up. Things that are so absurd, we just discount all UFO things because these certain groups have taken it to such an extreme that it is completely untenable. Everyone's throwing out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak, when it comes to UFOs and strange entities and channeling and all that good stuff. It can be taken way too far. But there's a lot of good stuff there too. Let's get into the political overtones. Are UFO groups being watched? I've alluded to the fact that the major groups of UFO believers have been closely monitored by government agents. There is a good reason for this attention. Their influence can be manipulated for political goals or simply as a test of various forms of deception. Yeah, go watch the documentary Mirage Men. Goes over this beautifully. One of the recommendations of a recently declassified CIA/US Air Force panel on UFOs, which met in Washington in 1953, was precisely to monitor the activities of civilian groups. The panel took cognizance of the existence of such groups as the quote-unquote civilian flying saucer investigators of Los Angeles and the quote-unquote aerial phenomena research organization in Wisconsin. It was believed that such organizations should be watched because of their great influence on mass thinking. If widespread sightings should occur, the apparent irresponsibility and the possible use of such groups for subversive purposes should be kept in mind. That last one, the use of such groups for subversive purposes. That's, their favorite. Love to pit us against each other, don't they? It is difficult to be more explicit. The political control factor does explain certain bizarre aspects of the UFO problem, including the behavior of some celebrated contactees who could have been set up in their roles in order to propagate alleged extraterrestrial messages in this and other countries. For example, George Adamski has confessed that 4 U.S. government scientists were responsible for launching his career as an ambassador for the Space Brothers. These scientists were from Point Loma Naval Electronics Laboratory near San Diego, and from a similar setup in Pasadena. They asked him if he would cooperate in the collective attempt to get photographs of strange craft moving through space. Adamski's major supporter abroad was a former intelligence officer with the British Army, with whom I have personally met, and a Cambridge engineering graduate who now lives in Mexico. Dang, I think we've read about Adamski and other like Monsters of the Midnight or book clubs. I did not know that he was a government agent. There we go. A Mirage man and a Cambridge engineering graduate who now lives in Mexico. A man who hosted Adamski during this tour of Australia has told me that, quote unquote, good old George was traveling with a passport bearing special privileges. The political factor also explains the deliberate infiltration of civilian UFO groups by persons linked to the intelligence world. In terms of social behavior control, civilian UFO groups would be as necessary to an effective mechanism as Project Bluebook or the Condon Committee, because they would provide an escape valve for the steam of the enthusiasts and a useful channel for planted stories. Admiral Roscoe H. Hillenkoetter, a former CIA chief who stated, "It is imperative that we learn what UFOs are and where they come from," and later joined the board of directors of the National Investigations Committee of Aerial Phenomena, or NICAP, could have lent credibility to the stratagem by deliberately promoting the extraterrestrial theory. Also, among the leaders of NICAP, one of the most influential UFO groups in the 50s and 60s, were at least 3 well-known intelligence operatives: Bernard Corvallo, Nicholas de Rochefort, and Colonel Joseph Ryan. And I'm telling you, once you're a spook, you're always a spook. You're always working for them. You can't fully trust these dudes. Men who are trained practitioners of the modern techniques of psychological warfare. It may seem preposterous for government to spend time and money testing the public's reaction to the idea of contact with extraterrestrials. Yet I strongly suspect at least 2 major UFO cases were covert experiments in rumor generation and in deliberate creation of contactee cults. One of these cases took place in Spain and one in France. To the skeptical reader, I can only point out that there are people on the government payroll whose job it is to devise contingency plans for all sorts of extreme situations. Under the Nixon administration, a White House task force had even proposed a scheme for the invasion of Cuba that involved a submarine equipped with lasers. It would, quote unquote, paint an image of Christ over the island to simulate a second coming. This miracle, it was thought, would disturb the Catholic population in Havana, paralyze communications, and disorganize the Cuban armed forces long enough for commandos to seize strategic points and overthrow the Castro regime. And that's just an idea they didn't do. When I finish Dimensions, we're going to read The Devil's Chessboard. It's a long one. It's kind of tough to get through, but I think it's going to be fun. It talks about all this stuff and how and why the CIA does it. In his well-documented book, War on the Mind, clinical psychologist Peter Watson, who was a member of the Sunday Times quote-unquote insight team, which investigated, among other things, the use of psychological warfare by the British, reveals that equipment has been developed to use low-lying clouds as a screen-off to which to bounce a huge propaganda show. Tape recordings of primitive gods have been prepared to be played from helicopters, thus frightening tribes. And what do they have now? This book was published in 1988. So you could only imagine 40 years about later what we have now, what they could spook us with now. During the Vietnam War, a U.S. military unit called the 4th PSYOP Group invented an image projector called the Mitterlux. It used 85 millimeter slides and 1,000-watt bulbs to project pictures on buildings, mountains, and cloud banks. I believe that it is imperative for scientists to study UFOs, but we should not do it naively. With the progress of human technology, it has become impossible to study any UFO report without considering the possibility of a deliberate deception, along with all other classical hypothesi. Any UFO groups are gullible to any rumor that seems to support the extraterrestrial credo, without seriously investigating where the rumor comes from and who may have an interest in spreading it. The skeptical zeal of some of the more vocal debunkers is also inspired by the need to maintain political control, to prevent genuine scientific study from being organized. All that is needed is to maintain a certain threshold of ridicule around the phenomena. This can be done easily enough by a few influential science writers under the guise of humanism or rationalism. UFO research is equated by them to as false science, thus creating an atmosphere of guilt by association, which is deadly to any independent scientist. Efforts are made to systematically discredit professional researchers who investigate the phenomena. The history of the interaction between flying saucer contact and politics goes back to the early California contactees. Whoop, whoop. George Van Tassy. In those days, many occult groups linked to power-hungry organizations were extremely active. Right after World War II, when a branch of Aleister Crowley's Neo-Templar cult flourished in Los Angeles, two of the most ardent members were Jack W. Parsons, a propulsion engineer. We talked about Parsons a lot. He got us to space. And L. Ron Hubbard, a science fiction buff. Jack Parsons claimed to have met a Venetian in the desert in 1946 and went on to be one of the founders of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory and of the Aerojet Corporation, although JPL may deny this connection. And when you talk to, what's the other? I'm forgetting his name, but I'll look it up for the YouTube and put it up here. The other scientist who came over with after World War II from Germany, another space scientist. Well, anyway, another rocket guy. He would say Parsons is the reason we got to space. He helped, but with Parsons, it was the reason we got there. And Parsons was allegedly in contact with otherworldly beings that told him how to do it. And we all know what the fart that L. Ron Hubbard guy did. L. Ron Hubbard went on to found Dianetics and Scientology. According to my information, contactee George Adamansky had pre-war connections with the American fascist leader William Dudley Pelley, who was interned during the war. Another seminal contactee, George Hunt Williamson, whose real name was Michael Deovernick, was associated with Pelley's organization in the early 50s. In fact, Pelley may have put Williamson in touch with Adamansky. Other associates of Williamson during the great era of the flying saucers were such contactees as John McCoy and two Stanford brothers, Ray and Rex. The connections among all these men, who have been very influential in shaping the UFO myth in the United States, are quite intricate. William Dudley Pelley, who died in 1965, was the leader of the Silver Shirts, an American Nazi group that began its activities in 1932. Its membership overlapped strongly with Guy Ballard's I Am movement. Pelley declined to join the other fascist groups in their support for Congressman LeMink in 1936, standing on his own in Indiana as a Christian Party candidate. His opposition to Roosevelt increased until his 8-year internment for sedition in 1942. After the war, he started an occult group, Soulcraft, and published a racist magazine called Valor. He also wrote the book Starguests in 1950, a compilation of automatic writing reminiscent of the Seth material. It was about 1950 that Williamson is said to have begun working for Pelley at the offices of Soulcraft Publications in Noblesville, Indiana, before moving to California, where he witnessed Adamansky's desert contact on November 20th, 1952, with a Venetian that had long blonde hair. Williamson, however, had assured me that he never embraced any of the racist theories that the pro-Nazi movements promoted. Perhaps Adamansky and Pelley knew one another as a result of their common interest in the I Am cult. Dr. Laughhead, interesting name, who inspired the contacts of Mrs. Keach in the Midwest and later launched Dr. Andrea Puchiark on the tracks of the mythic Spectra, is also said to have been associated with this group. Oh, what? Okay. So this Dr. Laughhead dude, he's what put these people's on. He put the people on it. So whether they're actually contacting something or not, this Laughhead guy was sent to them by an agency to make it happen. John McCoy, who co-authored with Williamson the book UFOs Confidential, operated the Essene Press. He introduced the idea that the worldwide conspiracy was involved in the UFO problem. The Stanford brothers were living in the same Texas town, Corpus Christi, as McCoy, and in the 1950s, they produced a series of contact books, of which listed McCoy as co-author. I find these curious analogies between the statements of these contactee organizations and those of Bob Berry, the director of the 20th Century UFO Bureau, headquartered in Collingwood, New Jersey. The Bureau is one of the groups that compose the fundamentalist religious organization headed by the Reverend Carl McIntry. Berry stated in June 1978 that he had 3 excellent sources, one government, the others retired from highly sensitive positions, who asserted that the government was quite concerned with the UFO problem and had recovered a total of 18 bodies after UFO crashes. An interesting belief of Mr. Berry's is that the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind was part of the government plan to condition the public. The plan in this country is on schedule, Berry said in an interview with Edgar Williams of the Night News Service. 3 years ago, it was decided to do TV documentaries and observe public reaction. Some of the believers insist that the movie by Alan Sandler Productions, UFOs Past, Present, is that Alan Sandler? Is that related to Adam Sandler? But anywho, Productions UFOs Past, Present, and Future could have been such a test. Berry observes the reaction was good. So the next step was to film Close Encounters. Now, in a little while, there doubtless will be the beginning of government advisories that UFOs are indeed with us. I mean, that started, right? The government acknowledges that now with the TikTok videos. Am I right or wrong? I don't know. Since I was a narrator of the Sandler documentary and indirectly a contributor to Close Encounters, I found these remarks interesting. Everyone is now so eager to see the government reveal this long-awaited information that no one questions the reality of the basic facts and the political motivations that could inspire a manipulation of those facts. Trying to outsmart the CIA and the Pentagon has become such a national pastime that lawsuits against federal agencies under the Freedom of Information Act have begun to accumulate. All that has been shown so far is that these agencies were involved, often covertly, in many aspects of the UFO problem. I suspect that they are still involved. If they were doing it, they're still doing it. Discovering the secret of the UFO propulsion mechanism could be such a military breakthrough that any research project connected with it would enjoy the highest level of classification. But these UFO enthusiasts, who are so anxious to expose the government, have not reflected that they may be playing into the hands of a more sophisticated cover-up of the real situation. Yeah, they want us to play these games, man. Because of their eagerness to believe any indication that the authorities already possess the proof of UFO reality, many enthusiasts provide an ideal conduit for anyone wishing to spread the extraterrestrial gospel. The purpose of such an exercise need not be complex or strategically important. It could be something as mundane as a political diversion or a test of the reliability of the information channels under stimulated crisis conditions, or a decoy for paramilitary operations. None of these rumors is likely to lead us any closer to a solution that can only be obtained by careful, sincere, intelligent, and perhaps tedious scientific research. The truth is that the UFOs may not be spacecraft at all, and the government may simply be hiding the fact that, in spite of the billions of dollars spent on air defense, it has no more clues to the nature of the phenomenon today than it did in the 40s when it began its investigations. It's all on the table. All I know is that the cover-up is definitely happening. And if you're interested in more details about the Great American UFO Cover-Up, this book here out there is really, really eye-opening as into the modern UFO cover-up. Today we kind of explored the cover-up up until the 80s. This one goes beyond into the 90s and into our era. So check it out. Cover-up definitely still happening. That is Dimensions Chapter 8, the Triple Cover-Up. Will we ever escape? Yeah, just win, you know? If you're asking me, yeah, I think that's what makes it so complicated. We have actual sightings happening. We have the government spreading rumors and lies, giving us like a sandwich of like the bread. A little bit of the meat is truth, right? And then everything else is just like filler, just lies. Check out Mirageman too if you're interested in the cover-up. That's a really good documentary if you don't want to read the books. That's all I got for you though. Thank you for joining me, Saturday Morning Book Club. Next week we'll get to chapter 9 of Dimensions, and that chapter is called The Case Against Extraterrestrials. Woo! So we'll get into old Jacques Vallée's theory of what these UFOs are. Ta-ta. Oh.